This war translated story shows how little the Russian occupation really cares about what locals want. The pitch that the Russian government made at the start of this war, well, they made a few pitches as to why they had to. They had no other choice but to start the largest war in Europe since World War II. They made a lot of arguments. The first argument was NATO expansion. I think it's nonsense. I think very firmly that it's nonsense. Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO than it was 6 years, 7 years, 8 years ago. No closer. So I don't know why all of a sudden they have to invade Ukraine to stop NATO expansion, right? I think that's nonsense. Another one was denazification, which I think translates into regime change because the Russians sent in neo-Nazi militias like Rusich to do the fighting. I don't send in neo-Nazis to clean up my neo-Nazis to get rid of all the neo-Nazism, right? That doesn't make much sense, right? I'm not going to fund Joseph Goebbels to fight against the anti-Semitism of Adolf Hitler. That doesn't work. So I think what that really translates to in a practical sense is regime change, right? But the narrative was Nazism. But one of the big narratives that got pushed more in the West for the first time in a long time, we're seeing this narrative get pushed more and more now during the war. We're seeing it a lot more in English-speaking media from Russian talking heads. That means they're actors in the West talking and saying their talking points, either for direct financial gain from them, or for clout, or because they're fascists, if I'm being blunt. I see a lot of Russia's coming to Ukraine to defend the Russian speakers, to defend the locals who don't want to live under the Ukrainian regime. Now, there is no polling data that suggests that the majority of the populations in Kherson and Zaporozhye, much less, Donetsk and Luhansk, much less Kherson and Zaporozhye, wanted to be part of Russia. There is no polling data that suggests that. And there's been enough local resistance to suggest that a lot of people oppose it. But recently, the Russians have produced their own data that suggests that even though millions of people have been displaced and have left these occupied areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, of the people that are still there, so we're not including the millions who have fled, but of the ones who stayed behind, about 50% of the population still identifies as Ukrainian, maybe. I'm throwing out this maybe here, and I'll explain it in a moment. But if that means we have all the millions who left, who fled the Russian advance, and a decent amount still left locally that still support, the idea of being Ukrainian and wanting to be part of the Ukrainian nation state, that suggests that not only is the majority of the people in the region from before the war, from before they were displaced, pro staying part of Ukraine, it's overwhelming. It's not even close, which correlates with what my personal conversations on the ground and correlates with what the data has shown before. But let's read this war translated post because I think it's very interesting into showing how even the Russians know they don't nearly have as much support as they talk about on TV. Russian propagandists are shocked by the fact that 46% of children in temporarily occupied areas of Zaporozhye region wish to study in the Ukrainian language. In their minds, this will lead to lower levels of education. Not a supremacist mindset whatsoever. If I was them, I would, this is personal commentary from War Translated. But let's talk about that number for a moment before we read their post and then read the amount of smarmy kind of above you dialogue that's in this post. 46% of children going back to school in occupied territory want to learn in Ukrainian. So first, you've removed the people who have fled. Those are the ones who they're not going to school there. So those people are counted out, but those are going to be overwhelmingly pro-Ukrainian. Then you've got to count out the people who would be too scared to fill in the data saying, yeah, I want to speak Ukrainian, because we have the president of Russia signing executive orders. That means that they could take away your property rights in occupied territory. They can deport you, kick you out of your home, and then give it to somebody from Moscow, from Tuva, and have somebody from another region in Russia settle your home. Like what they did in Crimea in the 1950s under the Stalin regime when he engaged in ethnic cleansing there. So there would be people who would just be scared to answer that way. And then there's also the people who are not going to send their children to Russian schools because they're scared that they're going to be brainwashed. And I think for good reason. They have a good reason to feel that fear. But even when you take out all those factors, you still get to roughly 50% of the population's children who want to learn Ukrainian, want to speak Ukrainian. And this again, is the official Russian report. They don't have nearly as much support as they think. They don't. They don't at all. Let's read their post. Let's read their post. Wonderful things are happening in the Zaporozhye region. According to information from regional authorities, 46% of children expressed a desire to study Ukrainian as their native language. We understand that this choice is often made by adults. These figures mean that, so they're basically saying these are their parents, keeping them speaking Ukrainian. It's their, their evil Ukraino-Nazi parents. These figures mean that these children will not be integrated into the Russian education system. They will not integrate into Russian society. They will not be able to enter Russian universities. After finishing school, these children will go to the eastern regions of Poland, where Ukrainian farm laborers will live. They don't know that. The level of education, by the way, and if they do that, the reason they did that is because there's no more local jobs because you destroyed them all with your invasion. The level of education of these children will be, to put it mildly, low. The justification they're building here for maybe even forcing people to learn Russian is the same justification that Stalin's regime used. We need to centralize our education here in the Soviet Union, and we should centralize it around the Russian language, makes it easier for us. But that dominates the other cultures, that dominates the other languages. That's how you get countries like Ireland, where their own people, the vast majority of them, can't even speak their native tongue. They can't speak their own language. And look, not all societies are going to care about those things, but there are societies that do care about preserving their native language. People who do want their children to speak the mother tongue of their country. And I think that's a perfectly normal and fair desire for a people to have. That the people still living in occupied territories have. But the logic that is being formed to erase the Ukrainian language, erase the Ukrainian culture, to forcefully assimilate them, this is the logic they're going to use. This is the stuff they're going to peddle. So when they start saying, actually, you can't study Ukrainian anymore, if that legislation ever gets put in, where they pass that, which I don't think that's an impossibility, considering the lengths that the Russians have gone so far, this is the type of logic they're going to use. That they have to integrate them, that they have to assimilate them. This is the practice of forced assimilation, and I would say, a type of cultural genocide. That is what they're trying to do. And I can beat around the bush and say and pretend that it isn't happening and not use scary words like genocide, but those are the words we need to start talking about. When Russia denies that the Ukrainians exist, they say they're fake, they're deporting their children into schools where they then pump them full of, and doing this in Russia, deporting them to Russian schools, where they pump them full of Russian nationalistic propaganda, say you're not Ukrainian, you're a Russian, and they start building the foundation to make it so that Ukrainian isn't taught in Ukraine. That foundation is being built up, man. If you look at the statistics in Crimea, less than 4% of the students study there in Ukrainian. It is very difficult for me to understand the logic and actions of the authority of the Zaporozhye region. By law, there is only one official language in Russia, Russian. All other languages are studied as electives. Again, they want to make the Russian culture, language, everything dominant in occupied territory. This was never about protecting the Russian speakers. This was always about dominating Ukraine with the Russian language, with Russian culture, and erasing the Ukrainian identity. And that process is already underway in occupied territory, and God forbid, it goes to completion before this territory is liberated, of people having their culture erased, their language erased, and anyone who resists it getting deported out of their homes to only have the previous homes that many of them built with their own bare hands to be replaced with settlers from Russia proper, which I would call ethnic cleansing. If we were to take over Mexico, a part of Mexico tomorrow, call it a part of America, and then start deporting everybody who disagreed with us, didn't want to learn English, didn't want to call itself American, that would be ethnic cleansing. If we called it ethnic cleansing, we'd be like, yeah, that's obviously ethnic cleansing. This is horrible that America's doing it. But because these words carry so much weight, because these words hurt, because that's real, oh my God, that's a really big, hard word. It would have to motivate many of the countries that support Ukraine into deeper action. Because if it's one of those situations where we're talking about the word genocide happening in the same place where European powers promised it would never happen again, I mean, that would be a massive failure of human civilization, wouldn't it? Oh, actually, here's another post from Dmitry. Meanwhile, propagandists are not shying away from calling for a genocide of everything Ukrainian in Ukraine. They believe no one met them with flowers because of the propaganda and not because of the mass murders. I believe that the goal of the SMO should be changed so that this would be lost, so that this would be the last war in Ukraine. Number 1, demilitarization. Number 2, Russification. Otherwise, all sacrifices are in vain. Ukraine is not land, but an idea. Without pseudo-language, the independent church, and the assimilation of Russian children, it will not exist. That is why the Russian language was banned there from schools to TV. The church was destroyed, and the state language pours out of all the cranks. For 9 years, they turned Russians into Ukraine. By the way, the Russian language, you can still speak the Russian language in Ukraine. There is some regulations on the Russian language in media and stuff like that, mostly in response to many of Russia's policies against the Ukrainian language and the suppression of the Ukrainian language. I think a lot of it is backlash, a reaction to try to defend their language so that they don't have it like a situation as they have in Ireland right now where nobody knows the Irish language. Everybody speaks English. For 9 years, they turned Russians into Ukrainians. And that's why no one greeted us with flowers in February of 2022, as they would have done in 2013. We must stop the policy of indigenization, national, personal, and Ukrainianization of the Russian land. The experiment of the 20s of the last century failed and cost the Russian people dearly.